Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
දසනකාන්තී චූර්ණය සහිත ලීවර් ආයුෂ් දන්තාලේපය දත්වල ඇති ප්‍රශ්න 10ක් වළකයි.
In your headlines tonight, we stand ready. As a creditor of Sri Lanka, the United States will support the restructuring of debt and extend financing assurances, assures US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Prevent past violations, impunity for human rights violations and economic crimes, an underlying cause of Sri Lanka's prevailing economic crisis, points out a report by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. From the sources, some 30 new state ministers expected to be sworn in tomorrow, this Wednesday, 7th of September 2022.
Vim Deera milliliter CA Smart Pack එක රුපියල් 85ට දැන් වෙළඳ පොලේ.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome joining you tonight on First at 9. I'm Indivari Amuatta. At a time when Sri Lanka is expecting good faith from creditors, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the United States will support the restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt and extend financing assurances to the country. Yellen also said the US Treasury will engage with other US government agencies, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank as well, to support Sri Lanka's talks with the IMF.
In a letter seen by Reuters, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said the United States will support the restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt and extend financing assurances to Sri Lanka. She said the United States, as a creditor, stands ready to participate in a restructuring of Sri Lanka's debt and called on all creditors to cooperate fully in the negotiations and restructuring. She added that to support Sri Lanka's talks with the IMF, the US Treasury will engage with other US government agencies, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. This development came days after the announcement of the Paris Club that they will support Sri Lanka's debt restructuring process. Further, China too said that they will stand ready to work with Sri Lanka's creditors and international financial institutions to help the island ease the debt burden and realize sustainable development. Debt negotiation and restructuring with creditors is an important aspect for Sri Lanka to obtain the proposed $2.9 billion from the International Monetary Fund. A staff level agreement with the global lender was reached on Thursday last week, where the proposed $2.9 billion are expected to be disbursed throughout the next 4 years.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe sent his congratulatory letter to UK's newly appointed Prime Minister Liz Truss and said he anticipates further strengthening of the relationship with the United Kingdom, particularly in the context of a global Britain and the UK's new Platinum Partnership scheme with the Commonwealth family of nations. President Wickremesinghe also appreciated Sri Lanka's inclusion as a beneficiary country in the recently announced Developing Country Trading Scheme of the UK. The President said as Sri Lanka stands prepared to celebrate its 75th anniversary of independence in February 2023, Sri Lanka looks forward to the further consolidation of cooperation with the UK. He also went on to say that the multifaceted partnership reinforced by the democratic ideals encompasses a wide spectrum of engagement ranging from political, economic and cultural relations to strong people-to-people interactions. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights urges the Sri Lankan government to embark on a national dialogue to advance human rights and reconciliation. In the latest report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Sri Lanka's human rights situation, the High Commissioner's office called for accountability and deeper institutional reforms to prevent recurrence of past violations. In the latest report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Sri Lanka's human rights situation, It said the serious economic crisis, which has severely impacted the human rights of all communities and people of all walks of life, has spurred broad-based demands by Sri Lankans for all communities for deeper reforms and accountability, and gives the government a fresh opportunity to steer the country on a new path. For sustainable improvements to take place, however, it is vital to recognize and address the underlying factors which have contributed to the economic crisis, including embedded impunity for past and present human rights violations, economic crimes, and endemic corruption. According to the report, fundamental changes will be required to address the current challenges and to avoid repetition of the human rights violations of the past. The report calls on the government to immediately end the reliance on draconian security laws and crackdowns on peaceful protests, reverse the drifts towards militarization, and show renewed commitment to and deliver on security sector reforms ending impunity. The report further said, while the security forces recently showed considerable restraint in response to mass protests, the government has since taken a harder line approach, arresting some student leaders under the Prevention of Terrorism Act and violently suppressing peaceful protests. The report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights urges the new government to relaunch a comprehensive and victim-centered strategy on transitional justice and accountability with a time-bound plan to implement outstanding commitments, including taking steps in relation to the establishment of a credible truth-seeking mechanism and an ad hoc special court. It also went on to say the victims must be given a central role in the design and implementation of all accountability and transitional justice mechanisms. Expressing concern about the lack of progress to establish the truth about the Easter Sunday bombings in 2019, the report also calls for a follow-up independent and transparent investigation with international assistance to the full participation of victims and their representatives to pursue further lines of inquiry. The report said the Sri Lankan state, including through successive governments, has consistently failed to pursue an effective transitional justice process to hold perpetrators of gross human rights violations and abuses accountable and uphold victims' rights to true justice and reparations. Citing an absence of progress towards accountability at the national level, the report urges other states to cooperate in accountability efforts, including by using available avenues of extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute crimes under international law committed in Sri Lanka. Sources told AdaDerana that several new state ministers will be sworn in tomorrow morning. It is also reported that close to around 13 new state ministers are expected to be sworn in. Parliamentarians tipped as state ministers will take their oath before President Ranil Wickremesinghe at the Presidential Secretariat in the morning. A circular has been published granting 5-year no-pay leave for public officers to be spent in or out of the country without affecting their seniority and pensions. The communique was issued by the Secretary to the Ministry of Public Administration, Home Affairs and Provincial Councils. On the 13th of June, the Cabinet granted approval to amend existing provisions to allow government employees to take no-pay leave for employment or other productive work abroad or to work in the private sector in the country. Later, on the 23rd of June, a 7-member committee was appointed to look into the matter and was tasked with submitting its report to the Cabinet of Ministers along with its recommendations. On Monday, the Cabinet green-lighted the proposal tabled by Prime Minister to implement the recommendations of the committee. Millions can't afford adequate diet, the World Food Programme says in Sri Lanka. Details after this break.
අයිනෝ පුතා හැබැයි යා ගෙදර නිදියන්නෙම අමුතු තැනක.
කාලගුණය කොහොමුණත් රයිනෝ නං වහලට සේෆ් තමයි මුළු ගෙදරම. Rhino Cement Roofing Sheets. Then you know Rhino. I know.
Big 3.
Uber Eats මගින් ඉදිරිපත් කරන ආදරයෙන් අවශ්‍යතා ඇති අයට අත්‍යවශ්‍ය භාණ්ඩ පරිත්‍යාග කිරීමට වේදිකාවක්.
Welcome back to the news. The United Nations World Food Programme says that the hunger levels in Sri Lanka, based on their surveys, are rising sharply and added that millions of the poorest Sri Lankans can no longer afford an adequate diet. The programme's regional director, Derana English, said that they fear the situation may get worse in the weeks to come, adding that the situation makes WFP's response extremely critical.
In a statement issued by the United Nations World Food Programme's office in Sri Lanka, following the conclusion of its regional director in Asia Pacific, John Ailey's visit here, it said the latest WFP surveys show that hunger is rising sharply in Sri Lanka, where nearly half of the households interviewed by them were facing challenges in accessing food amid income losses, record levels of food price inflation, disruptions to the food supply chain, and severe shortages of basic commodities including fuel. The WFP Regional Director in Asia Pacific said millions of the poor Sri Lankans can no longer afford an adequate diet and they fear the situation may get worse in the weeks to come. He also said that this situation makes WFP's response extremely critical, adding that their priority is to reach families with life-saving food and nutrition assistance, with children and women at the heart of their response. The WFP aims to reach 3.4 million people with food, cash or vouchers while supporting national programs including school meals and Triposha.
We need to avoid this crisis, and to avoid this crisis we need to act very quickly. We are working tirelessly to implement our program, and even more tirelessly at the moment to fill the $20 million funding gap which we currently face and which puts our operation in jeopardy. What's also needed is urgent measures to kickstart the economy. The economy has taken a huge hit through the economic crisis, and we're seeing that both at central level here in Colombo, but really all over the country. Agriculture is essential, and so measures are needed to provide fertilizers and agricultural inputs for the upcoming season. However, that economic stimulus needs to come in large volumes and come quickly.
Minister of Education and Leader of the House, Dr. Susil Premajayantha, says there can be an increase in the malnutrition levels of the country based on the worsening state of the economy and social situation since last year. Speaking in Parliament today, Opposition Leader Sajith Premadasa meanwhile said that the United Nations World Food Programme earlier warned the government of a possible food shortage in the country.
දර්ශක සමස්තයක් ලෙස සැලකීමේදී 2016 වර්ෂයට සාපේක්ෂව 2020 වර්ෂයේදී ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ පාසල් යන වයසේ සිසුන්ගේ කෙටි කාලීන මන්ද පෝෂණ තත්ත්වයේ අඩුවීමක් පෙන්눔 කෙරේ. එහෙත් 2021 වර්ෂයේ රට තුළ පවතින සමාජ හා ආර්ථික අයහපත් තත්ත්වයේ හේතුවෙන් මේ වන විට මේ දර්ශක අගයක් ඉහළ ගොස් මන්ද පෝෂණ පෙළෙන ප්‍රමාණය ඉහළ යාමක් අපේක්ෂා කළ හැකිය.
මේ 2021 සංගණනයත් මේ ආර්ථික අර්බුදයට කලින් තියෙන සංගණනයක් කළා තියෙනවා. ආර්ථික අර්බුදයට පස්සේ රටේ පෝෂණ තත්ත්වය ඊට වඩා ඉතා භයානක තත්ත්වයකට දැන් ඇවිල්ලා තිබෙනවා. ළමා රෝහලේ තත්ත්වය ලෙඩ වුණු පොඩි එවුන්ට දෙන්න කෑමක් නැති වෙයි. ළමා රෝහල වහාම ආධාර ඉල්ලයි. WFP එක World Food Programme එක මීට අවුරුද්දකට පෙර රජයට කියලා තියෙනවා එන තත්ත්වය එච්චර හොඳ නැහැ. ආහාර හිඟයක් එයි. අපිට අවස්ථාව ලබා දෙන්න සර්වේ එකක් කරන්න. හිතා මතාම මාස 12ක් පමණ මේ සර්වේ එක ක්‍රියාත්මක කිරීම නතර කරා. මම දන්නවා සංඛ්‍යාලයකන එළියට එයි කියන බයට තමයි ඒ සර්වේ එක නොකළේ.
ඊයේ මේ විවාදයේදී මේ විරුද්ධ පක්ෂ මන්ත්‍රීතුමියක් සඳහන් කරා අපේ රට දැවැන්ත ආහාර අර්බුදයකට යනවා මන්ද පෝෂණ තත්ත්වයකට යනවා. හැබැයි ඒක එහෙම නෑ. එහෙම නැති බව තමයි විද්‍යාත්මක දත්ත අපිට පෙන්눔 කරන්නේ.
මම කනගාටු වෙනවා ඇත්තටම රමේෂ් පතිරණ වගේ වෛද්‍යවරයෙක් ඇමතිවරයෙක් මේ යුනිසෙෆ් ආයතනයේ වාර්තා බොරු කියන්න හිට ගැනීම පිළිබඳ 2014 වසරේ සිට 2016 වසර දක්වා දත්ත පදනම් කරගෙන තමයි මෙවැනි ප්‍රකාශයක් යුනිසෙෆ් ආයතනය කරලා තියෙන්නේ.
Minister of Education Dr. Susil Premajayantha said that a procedure will be prepared meanwhile to inspect school bags of students of urban and leading schools in the country. Further, the minister mentioned that necessary instructions regarding the inspection of school bags of students will be issued through a circular next week.
මද්ද්‍රව්‍ය සඳහා පාසල් ළමුන් පවා යොමු වීමේ අනතුරක් ඇති බව ඔබතුමා පිළිගන්නේද? මෙම බරපතල ව්‍යසනයෙන් රට නිදහස් කර ගැනීම සඳහා ගෙන ඇති වැඩපිළිවෙල කුමක්ද?
මම බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා විශේෂයෙන්ම නාගරික පරිසරය. ඒ වගේම ප්‍රධාන පාසල් ආශ්‍රිත පාසල් වලට එන දරුවන්ගේ බෑග් පරීක්ෂා කළා නැහැ. එක කාලයක් ඒක කළා. දැන් දෙක වෙන්නේ නැහැ. එතන මේවා තුල එක්ක ටොෆි හැටියට එහෙම නැත්නම් වෙනත් ආකාරයකින් මේවා එන්න පුළුවන්. ඒක නිසා චක්ලේඛනයක් වගින්ම මම බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා ලබන සතිය වෙනකොට සීලම පළාත් අධ්‍යක්ෂවරුන් හරහා මේවා පරීක්ෂා කරන්නයි.
A special category for fuel quota increases is expected to be tested on selected private and public sector entities this week. According to the Energy Minister Kanchana Vijayasekara, this was decided at a meeting with development partners and stakeholders to review the national fuel pass based on QR system. Meanwhile, a tourist fuel pass and non-vehicle category will be introduced next week. The filling station code 2 would be added from next week to the text message generated when obtaining fuel in order to prevent the discrepancies that are occurring when using the national fuel pass. In the review meeting, it was also decided to make available automated reports for filling station dealers effective from today. Minister of Power and Energy Kanchana Vijayasekara meanwhile officially requested the chairman of the Committee on Public Finance to commence an inquiry into the alleged irregularities of the awarded coal term tender. He said false allegations levelled against the awarded tender have created suspicion on transparency and on pricing. In a letter directed to the Committee of Public Finance, Chairman Dr. Harsha De Silva, the minister explained that the Lanka Coal Company Private Limited had called for tenders for the procurement of 45,000 metric tons of coal in line with the government procurement guidelines. Minister Vijayasekara pointed out that despite proper process being followed in awarding the tender, there were widespread allegations about the process followed pertinent to the tender, calling for an in-depth inquiry into the procedure followed on an urgent basis as the procurement of coal for the next season is essential for continuous power generation in the country. Minister Vijayasekara said that it would be ascertained whether the process was transparent and competitive. He assured that the Power and Energy Minister and Lanka Coal Company Private Limited stand ready to provide all required information and documentation in order to assist the COPE on its inquiry. Now, Sri Lanka Navy seized an Indian trawler with 12 Indian fishermen poaching in Sri Lankan waters off Alampil in Mullaitivu. The Eastern Naval Command mounted the special operation to drive out the trawlers from Sri Lankan waters, deploying a fast-track craft attached to the Eastern Naval Command. During the operation, the Indian trawler was seized with 12 Indian fishermen on board along with their fishing gear. The seized trawler and the fishermen were brought to the naval dockyard in Trincomalee and are expected to face legal proceedings going forward. Taking you to the Colombo Stock Exchange, shares bounced back to green, reinstating the winning momentum as retail and high net worth participants unleashed their bullish bets on the back of improved investor confidence owing to the anticipated macroeconomic stability in the country. The all share price index embarked on a high note and traded positively throughout the session, advancing the main index up to 9,447, gaining 117 intraday points. Turnover was recorded at 6.1 billion rupees, striking a 3.5-week high, while settling well above the average monthly turnover of 3.8 billion rupees. SG Holdings multiple crossing trades on Expo accounted for 37.0% of turnover, bringing the transportation sector contribution to 41% as the highest contribution for the session, followed by food, beverage and tobacco sector contributing 16%. Export trades bolstered the net foreign inflow too for the day, while posting a high foreign participation. Now, at the weekly Treasury bill auction held today, 5.8 billion was accepted from 91-day maturity at a weighted average yield of 32.89%, unchanged from last week, and 19 billion was accepted from the 162-day maturity at 31.28%. 26 billion was accepted further from the 364-day maturity at a weighted average yield of 30.50. Post-bill auction, meanwhile, buying interest was visible on the secondary market on June 1st, 2025 and July 1st, 2025 maturity between the rates of 27.95 to 28% on the back of thin volumes. Certainly an interesting, exciting night it was for Sri Lanka. We'll see you again tomorrow at the same time. Good night.